Signore e signori, buonasera. Benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò della New York University. My name is Stefano Albertini, and I'm the director of the Casa. And please be patient, because this is the first event that we held here at the Casa after the death of our founder, Baroness Mariuccia Zerilli-Marimò, who left us last Saturday, suddenly. I've just sent to all our members, and probably all of you will receive an email in which I give you some details about her death, and I'll be flying to Europe tomorrow to be with her family and to pay my last respects to her. As we said in our message, it's in keeping with her spirit and her character that Casa continues its scheduled events as programmed. And I think this is the best homage that we can pay to her, because this is what she would have loved. And the last email that I got from her, a couple of days before she left, was in response to the invitation for this event. Even if she was on the other side of the ocean, she wanted to receive the emails and to know what was going on and who came and what they said and how many people were there. And her message started like this: appassionante la storia etrusca, 2 exclamation marks. What a passion, Etruscan history. And she was a history buff. She would read like basically a history book every day and then ask me questions that I couldn't answer. And it's a great pleasure to have this specific event, not only because la storia etrusca è veramente appassionante, but also because Friends of FAI was an institution that was particularly dear to her heart. As you know, Casa is home to the Department of Italian Studies here at New York University, but it is also home to Friends of FAI, that has a small office that was originally reserved in the plans for the Baroness as her office, and she gave it to Friends of FAI so they can continue their mission in support of the Italian heritage here in New York City. And without further ado, I would like to ask you to welcome Lucy Hill of Friends of FAI here in New York. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone. I'm Lucy. I'm the Executive Director of Friends of FAI, and of course I want to thank Stefano and the Casa Italiana for hosting us this evening. Obviously, we're all devastated by the loss of Baronessa Mariuccia Zerilli-Marimò, who was also on our advisory board and just such a kind and beautiful person. So she will be truly missed, and we're so fortunate to be able to collaborate with this institution and to be a part of her legacy. For those who are not familiar with Friends of FAI, we are a nonprofit organization based in the US that supports the work of FAI, the Fondo Ambiente Italiano, which serves as the national trust of Italy. So FAI has rescued and restored dozens of historic properties throughout Italy and opened them to the public. And though we oversee a number of ancient properties, none are nearly as ancient as Poggio Civitate. So we really appreciate and admire the work that's being done to uncover and preserve this important historic site. I'd like to thank the Etruscan Foundation and the Archaeological Institute of America for putting together this lecture, and very grateful to Dr. Erik Nielsen of Franklin University, who is going to present his research on this fascinating Etruscan site. I just also want to mention we have some great literature from the AIA. We have their newsletter upstairs. We also have public copies of Etruscan news from the past 4 years provided by Professor Larissa Bonfante, who unfortunately can't be here today. She's a real expert on Etruscan civilization. So we encourage you to take copies after the lecture. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Paula Lazarus, the president of the New York Society of the Archaeological Institute of America.
Thank you. Well, whoops, there we go. Hi, good to see everybody. Thanks for coming out this evening. Welcome on the behalf of the AIA New York Society, and thank you to the Casa, Italiana, to FAI, and to the Etruscan Foundation for their collaboration. Together, we have put together tonight's event, the AIA providing lecture, the Casa and FAI the space, and the Etruscan Foundation our reception. So between us, we hope you will really enjoy this collaborative effort. The Etruscan Foundation, for those of you who are unaware, was created in 1959 as a nonprofit charitable organization by Fernando Oreste Federico Cinelli and Sarah McGraw Cinelli in Detroit, Michigan, to promote the study and understanding of the Etruscan civilization. During the half-century it has been in existence, the foundation has lent support to numerous field projects in Etruscan archaeology, led by scholars whose efforts underscore the significance and success of the foundation's mission to help increase the understanding of the Etruscan civilization and the documentation of this uniquely innovative culture. This evening, we are pleased to have trustees from the Etruscan Foundation with us here tonight in support of this important program, and how fitting that the AIA New York Society was able to be the recipient of this year's lecture from the national organization, which, as many of you know, focuses on sharing knowledge gleaned from archaeological projects throughout the world and throughout different time periods, and by sponsoring public lectures, scholarships for students to work and study abroad and join archaeological projects, as well as funding for conservation efforts around the world. Your membership in the society, if you are not a member, consider it, is helpful to supporting all of those activities. And now to our speaker. We've already heard a bit about him. After 18 years at Franklin College, 17 as president and 1 as chancellor, Dr. Erik Nielsen stepped down in May 2013, having been accorded the title of President Emeritus. He has been a fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the Social Science and Humanities Council of Canada, and pertinent to tonight, he has directed and or co-directed an ongoing archaeological excavation at Poggio Civitate for the past 40 years. Tonight we look forward to hearing about this interesting site and how this complex has functioned. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you also afterwards at the reception.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me adequately with this? Good. All right. Let me begin by explaining that I am no longer the director of the excavations at Poggio Civitate. I retired 2 years ago, and that position is being more than adequately handled by my colleague, my former student, and now associate professor of archaeology at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, with his team, Professor Anthony Tuck, who is here in the audience. And I was advised before presenting or preparing my material that I should think about presenting this to a more general audience, and so I have worked accordingly on that guideline. On the other hand, we have found some remarkable new things at Poggio Civitate in the past summer, and I, through the kindness of Tony Tuck, who has allowed me to photograph and show these today, we have some unpublished material that I will share with you at the end, and also let you know a little bit about some of the questions that this raises for me in looking at this new material. So, without further ado, let us begin. This map will give you some idea of the concentration of the villages and towns that formed part of the Etruscan congregation, if you will. And you can see the boundaries of Etruria, basically marked out by the two major rivers,
the Tiber, starting up in the Apennine, working its way down through past Perugia, Orvieto, down through Rome, and then out at Ostia. That forms, in many ways, the eastern and southern border of Etruria, or at least the largest concentration of Etruscan cities. To the north, we have the Arno, also beginning up in the Apennines, working its way through Florence and then down to Pisa. And if we look in the middle, there is another river, this one less well known. It begins at a very small stream near Castellina in Chianti, actually called the Arbia, and then works its way down, becoming the Ombrone. It passes close to the site of Merlo, works its way down close to the site of Roselli, and then empties out into the mouth near Grosseto. And this, of course, provided a very natural avenue for traders to come in from the coast, leave their ships, and work their way inland. The site that we're going to be looking at today is called Merlo. You see it on this red dot and underlined here, right in the heart of Tuscany. When we look at this site, we are extremely fortunate to have found a remarkable series of buildings, a very large one belonging to the Archaic period that was extravagantly decorated, and it raises any number of questions for us. You can see the area today. We're looking toward the south, and the hill in the foreground is Poggio Civitate, roughly at an elevation of 615 meters. Behind it is a familiar city to good oenophiles, Montalcino at 567 meters. It's the home of Brunello wine. And in the distance, you will see Monte Amiata, which is one of the highest mountains in Tuscany. I don't think it's the highest, actually. Monte Abetone at 1,800 meters is, but this is 1,738. It's a pretty high mountain. Throughout the course of this lecture, and if you've been reading the literature, you will see that the site goes by really two names. Sometimes it's referred to as Merlo, and sometimes we refer to it as Poggio Civitate. Poggio Civitate is the name of the hill on which we're excavating, and Merlo is this little village here that you see on this little hilltop at about 300 meters. And at one time, early on, it was actually the administrative center for the area. Here you can see the relationship of Merlo to Poggio Civitate. It's about 0.6 of a kilometer, I think, from here to here. And in the foreground is Vescovado di Merlo, a more recent town, where the excavations by Professor Tuck and his team now have brought to light new material that shows a rather more attenuated, extended rather, habitation in the area. When we look at Merlo today, sometimes we forget, particularly when we're archaeologists and we're out in the field, and we're in a desolate area, we sometimes wonder, what were these people thinking, and why did they pick this particular place to live? And the fact of the matter is that there are a number of very good reasons, not the least of which is the fact that Merlo sits very close to the edge of the Catena Metallifera, which is a chain of metal-bearing hills that begins somewhere north of Volterra and works its way all the way down to Tolfa a Lumiere, just outside Rome. These hills provide some of the richest deposits of copper and iron in the Mediterranean. So being right on the edge of the Collina Metallifera provided the inhabitants with a very good source of wealth, mineral wealth, and provided much of the economic base for, I think, the Etruscans in this early period. It was certainly a reason for attracting Greeks, Phoenicians, other traders to come in and land along the coast and work their way inland, or even stop right on the coast for exchange of goods for copper and iron. On this slide here, you can see also the beginnings of the Maremma. Merlo was situated right on the edge of the Maremma, this heavy wooded area that goes all the way down to the coast, extremely rich in game, boar, deer, and other animals that were vital to the life of the Etruscans. And in addition, you can see over here the traces of the Collina Metallifera, which go all the way down along the coast. this little river, the Crevalle, works its way down around the corner, joins up with the Mersey River, and that in turn meets up with the Ombrone and heads down to the sea. So it was very rich. Looking to the west, you have mineral deposits, you have game, and to the east, we have great agricultural agrarian resources in the wheat fields. This slide was taken in 1974, and it shows you the foundations of a very large building which had been uncovered. Excavations began actually in 1966. By 1974, we had uncovered the extent of the main building of the Archaic period. The foundations are about 2.5 feet in height, and in some places even 3 feet across. Dry stone construction. On top of this would have stood a superstructure of mud brick and pisé, reinforced by timbers, and on top of that, a roof which was tiled and very heavily decorated. This plan will show you the extent of our excavations probably by some time, well, at least the blue building by 1979 and the yellow building, and then this came a little later. But the fact is, what we had uncovered was a monumental building in size, consisting of a series of rooms built around a courtyard, which was colonnaded. You can see the column bases here, here, and here, colonnaded on 3 sides and open to the sky. The building is 60 meters east-west and 60 meters north-south, with an extended 30 meters here of a defense wall, a 2-wall system, with a tower on this side and then another tower up here. The tower down here in the defense wall perhaps was used to protect the water supply, which was the well right here, which would have helped them in times of distress or if they were under siege. And here you see an artist's reconstruction at what we think the building may have looked like. Bear in mind, this is enormous in size, 60 meters by 60 meters. And you will notice that the artist has put in all of these little figures on the side, very elaborately decorated. I'd like you to keep in mind this little structure here. There are 3 rooms with a small structure in front. And we'll come back to that later on and throw some ideas out on how that might have functioned. You have to ask yourself, what was the building doing over here? The archaeological evidence would suggest that it was built sometime between 600, 580 in that period, and it was destroyed by 525. The latest pottery on the site is somewhere around that time period. It was systematically destroyed. All of the architectural decorations were taken down, they were broken up, and they were buried in pits that are scattered around the site, sometimes 30, 40 meters away, sometimes even further. The site was abandoned and it was not occupied again. So when we see something like this, we have to ask ourselves, well, how did it function? Who was living there? Is it a sanctuary, something this large? Is it the home of the local ruler? Is it a meeting place, a gathering place for public events? Is it the home of the high priest? How did it function within this community? The building was very elaborately decorated. Among some of the figures, we have this Sphinx made of terracotta. It would have been heavily painted. It's about 3.5 feet in length and 3 feet in height. It's one of a number of fantastic animals, such as winged bulls, lions, that decorated the roof of the building. And then there were also some rather naturalistic animals as well, such as horses, as you see here, and even boar, small boar heads. They're all of different scale, and they might have been applied next to each other or on different parts of the roof, on the different flanks, depending on the artist's whim. Perhaps the best known of these is this figure, affectionately known as the Cowboy because of this sombrero that he wears. He held in his hands probably some symbol of his authority. That has now perished. It was a perishable material, perhaps wood, and he has this strange Egyptianizing beard. He's about 4.5 feet in height, and he's one of a series of human figures that decorated the roof. Current thinking today is that he probably represents an ancestor and may have been used by the inhabitants of the building to point to their lineage and their right to authority through ancestors of this type of personages of great importance. Along the terminus of the roof, presumably facing the interior courtyard, was a very elaborate gutter system that you can see was decorated with alternating female heads and felines that served as water spouts, and they were separated by flowers. We call them rosettes, but they could have been lotus flowers or whatever. The current thinking, of course, is that this female head represents a deity. In Greece, she would have been known as the Potnia Theron, the mistress of the beasts. She is an earth mother type. Her familiar would be the lion, and because the water pouring out of his mouth, again, would be an association with life, as all life springs from water. And she is controller of nature, of animals, and also of vegetation. This would have been in the interior courtyard. The water could have been caught by barrels and jars lying underneath. On the exterior, at the terminus, the cover tiles were covered with plaques in the form of gorgon heads. And these gorgons would have been apotropaic devices intended to ward off evil, so anybody coming up to the site would have been faced with hundreds of these along the flank, with their tongues sticking out and their eyes probably painted in red and their tongues in red. And of course, they could turn you to stone with a stare. It's interesting that the female, of course, here the deity has in her more benign form the feline pouring out water, and in a more malevolent form, this gorgon. She is both a gorgon and a feline, and she is the giver of life and the taker of life. The building was further decorated with clay plaques. There are 4 different themes. I'm showing you just one here today. It's a horse race. You can see 3 riders moving from left to right. Their capes are blowing in the wind. They are riding bareback, and I think this gentleman here has a riding crop in his hand. And this is a bronze cauldron, a representation of a bronze cauldron on a stand. And that's the prize for which they were racing. The Sienese get very excited when they see this, because it reminds them of the Poggio. And if we were to believe the Sienese, they would say that this is proof of the Etruscan origin of the Poggio. So, the site, as I said, was abandoned. It was never occupied again. And as a result of that good fortune for us, we have a remarkable collection of relatively well-preserved elements of the roof, which allow us to reconstruct it in this manner, and it's perhaps one of the most detailed examples and complete examples of an Etruscan roof of this period. And you can see in these 2 slides the reconstruction as it now stands in the little museum of Murlo, where all of our material is on display, and it's open to the public. Now, as interesting as that building is, and I could spend a lot more time, what I really want to do is look at the building beneath this yellow structure. Because perhaps we can see in studying this building and the associated buildings some answers as to how the building in blue may have functioned during its floruit. The building in yellow was also decorated, not with figures in the round, but in these cutout figures, volutes that represent vegetal patterns, and also figured compositions such as this gentleman who sits on either a hippocamp or a horse. I'm not sure. In any event, he's a very important person. If he's sitting on a horse, he's part of the equestrian class, and again, a person of high rank in the community. You can see again in the museum the reconstruction of the roof, and very, very similar in construction to the roof tiles of the upper building. The same system is employed, only the decoration is different. This is another illustration. shows the three buildings that I'm going to be looking at. The building in the foreground, of course, is the one that I'm talking about at the moment. This is simply conjecture. We have no evidence for how the windows were, how many windows there were, what height they were at. We can look at tomb paintings, which influence some of our reconstructions. We can look at hut models, etc. But there is no evidence archaeologically from our foundations that will tell us the height of the building or the position of doors and windows. Interestingly enough, on the big building, just as an aside, we do know that the north wall probably rose to a height of 25 feet. And the reason is that we found a straight row of gorgons 8 meters off the wall, where the wall had just collapsed. So that gives us some indication of the height of the building and allows us to reconstruct a second story on the north side. This building also had an unfortunate demise. It was the victim of a fire, and the inhabitants raced out of the building because we don't have any human skeletons really from in here. But they got out of the building. The fire destroyed the building. The fire probably started over here in the workshop or down the hill in a kiln that may have exploded. It destroyed all three buildings on this particular site. The people got out and the building collapsed. At some time after that, the blue building that we've been talking about was built on top of it, in effect creating a sealed deposit. That's extremely important for us, because what we have lying on the floor in a relatively undisturbed manner is everything that was in use on the day of the fire. It's a time capsule for us, and it provides, in many ways, a chronological anchor, and that's extremely important. So let's see what we have on the floor. It'll give you some idea of the lifestyle of the people here. First, we have a small drinking cup. This is not a local product, but it is made in Corinth. And ceramic experts who work in that field would place this somewhere between the early Corinthian and the middle Corinthian series. In time, that would be sometime around 600, which is a rough date. But Corinthian pottery, for those who may not be familiar, is what we use very heavily in dating Etruscan artifacts for this particular period of time. So we rely on things like this. Here's an assortment of ceramics. These are also imported. They're not local. They're Greek wares. They're called Ionic bowls or East Greek bowls. They are high fire compared to our own local pottery. If you were to plink them with your finger, you would get a sound like porcelain coming out of them. Very high everted lip with a high shoulder that tapers down to a low foot, and then you have a ring base. And these have been fairly accurately dated to the period 620 to 580 from Greek sites. On the right, we have material from Sparta, Laconian II pottery. You can see some rims and part of a base moving toward the bottom of a cup with a ray pattern, which is typical of Laconian II. And then at the bottom, we have some Italo-Corinthian ware, perhaps from the center at Vulci, center of manufacture, where there are scenes in much of the style of Corinthian pottery, of the early and middle Corinthian style. These are very important for us in providing a chronological anchor for the destruction of the site. We therefore assume that the buildings, the three buildings that I'm going to show you, probably were destroyed sometime between 620 and 580. And in literature, both Professor Tuck and I have, for convenience sake, and even before that with Professor Phillips, we rounded it out to roughly 600 BC as just a rough way to arrive at and express the date of destruction of this building. Now, of local manufacture, we have something a little different, kind of a whimsical approach. You'll notice that the everted lip and the shoulder are very much similar to the Greek. The local artist took a Greek bowl and changed out the foot, putting in his own conical foot as opposed to a ring base, and then adding this very, very interesting handle. You can see this is a female, a deity of some type. She is winged, and she's holding long, long braids of hair, probably to emphasize her sensuality and her fertility. And so again, we would surmise that this is another example or representation of the Potnia Theron. Another variant, local product. Again, you see the wings of the goddess. She's clutching her braids of hair, but perhaps this is a more bellicose version. She's got springing out of her head another helmeted head. And I show you this just to give you an idea of the degree of quality of workmanship. Extremely fine. This is no more than 4 centimeters in height, and yet you can see modeled out of clay, the face, the details of the crested helmet, a very fine example of work in clay. Here's another example of a pot. Now this one is not, this cup rather, kaiathos, is not of local manufacture, but again, you have the female figure, no long braids of hair this time, shorter hair, but she's grasping 2 panthers by their necks. And you can see that the panthers have their heads turned toward you. Again, this is another manifestation of the mistress of the beasts. And this example, from others that have been found, we're quite certain that this comes from Cusi, an indication then of a relationship or contact between Cusi and Merlot in this period. Now, I just want to show you this. This is the fragment of a cup with the handle. This is the point where the handle begins on the side of the cup. To orient it properly, you would have to turn it 90 degrees clockwise. This should actually be pointing upward. But I have it this way because I want to show you this stamp and this stamp here. And what we have is a quadruped. Trust me on this. It's got 4 legs, 1, 2, and then 2 at the back, and it has this long neck, and he's turned back with his face resting on the rump. Over here we have what I would call a corrugated swastika, and you see part of it right here. And then the third element of design is this rope pattern. So we have 3 elements: the quadruped, the swastika, and the rope pattern. And why I find this interesting is that at the site of Roselli, also just off the Ombrone and about, well, a day and a half walk from Poggio Civitate down toward the sea, you would come to Roselli, and notice what we have. We have the same quadruped, we have the same corrugated swastika, and we have the same rope pattern. The stamps are the same. They are the same size. And so similar are these in the combination of the 3 that it is my feeling that these are the product of the same workshop. Now, whether that workshop was in Roselli and it brought things up to Merlot, or whether it was at Merlot and it sent things down, I'm not certain. We have not done a chemical analysis of this to my knowledge. Have we, Tony? We have done this one now? It's local? It's not local. Okay. That's what I was afraid of. It's more likely that it could come from Roselli and work up, or a third site that is providing material to both of these areas. Now, in addition, lying on the floor, small fragments of jewelry. This is a piece of an earring, and it has these 4 little buttercups, each with a granulated bead in the center. Stop and think about it for a moment. To solder this bead into the buttercup, you probably need a melting point that's different from the leaf itself. And so it's a pretty sophisticated technique of granulation that we find at this point in time. What is amazing about this is the size. There is the piece I just showed you in relationship to a penny. So extremely fine, fine work. I'm not saying this is local work, but clearly these people had the wherewithal to acquire some very sophisticated items. Another collection here of small figurines. This is carved probably from the leg bone of an animal, perhaps a deer in bone. It's a little winged griffin. It was finial that was probably attached to a piece of furniture. This small bronze in the shape of an owl, a beautiful little owl, was the handle for a lid of bronze to a large container. It would have been soldered on the top. On the underside, you see pieces of remains of tin that showed how it was soldered. We have a small attachment, an inlay to a vessel in the shape of a lion's head with a swan-like neck. And then this little stone figure, local serpentine. If you looked carefully, you would see it is a panther on the side attacking a boar. And there's the tusk of the boar right there. And you can see the cloven hoof of the boar, even very delicately carved in this piece of serpentine. On the underside is a seal. And you can see this winged creature, body of a lion perhaps with these big paws. He's got a wing, perhaps a serpentine-like tail, and this head, delightfully carved. And then there are carvings on both sides. So let's take a look at one of these. If you use your imagination, and you look very carefully, you might see dolphins. You have to use your imagination. There's one, and there's the other. And the reason I say they might be dolphins jumping or diving into the sea is because that is a motif that's not unpopular among the Etruscans. In Tomb of the Lioness here, you can see these dolphins jumping into the waves. On the other side, another creature that's been carved out. I don't know if you can make it out. It's a hippocamp. And again, a popular motif. What is interesting to keep in mind is the scale of the workmanship here, because all of this is carved in a figure that's the size of a drafting tack. Even smaller than that is this small amulet in bronze with a silver ribbon around the neck. That silver ribbon is smaller than the 1/2 the diameter of this pin. And this little ivory head was probably, it's carved in very high relief. It was probably applied to the top of a piece of furniture or maybe a box for a dinner service. I say dinner service because there were two other figures or fragments of figures associated with it. One shows an arm and a hand holding a cup, and the second has the forearm and the elbow of a figure that's resting on a pillow, so reclining on a couch. I think all three went together and probably represented a banquet scene. Again, the size is what is interesting. The ability to carve at this scale is quite remarkable for this time period. We can get even smaller with these little inlays. In addition, lying on the floor, bronze implements, perhaps fingernail files or rasps, maybe tools, utilitarian objects like simple fish hooks, small arrowheads for small game, rabbits, birds. And although the furniture is not preserved today, the wood has deteriorated, we are fortunate to still have the furniture tacks. Little bronze tacks that were sheathed in silver and sometimes gold would have been affixed to the furniture, either to hold the leather in place or to even hold parts of wooden members together. So to give you some idea of the opulence and the wealth of the people living here. A very, very elite family. I want to just quickly look at three pieces for a moment because I find them extremely interesting. This Gryphon that was carved from a leg bone of an animal. This little bone figure of a woman who's heavily cloaked. And then a fragment of a plaque, also carved of bone. You probably have a hard time seeing it, but let me show you an illustration at least that gives you the lotus chain elaborate carving on that plaque. Now I find these interesting because, in fact, at another site about 90 kilometers north, we have these two small sphinxes, about the same size. Look at the treatment of the wing. The leading edge of that wing has a border that's deeply carved that's very similar to this one. The feathers are, I think, the same to my eye. The beady eye. And the way the wing forms the breast in a deep curve can also be seen here. And then the sculpted treatment here, of the almost like a whittled effect of the body, is the same here. To my eye, these are the product of the same workshop. And I believe that workshop is at Murlo. So, in looking in the area around Murlo, we also find more lotus chain plaques that are similar to ours. We have the sphinxes, and lo and behold, we have these cloaked women. The plaques can be found both at Castellina in Chianti in a tomb and also up in Quinto Fiorentino. The sphinxes come from the same tomb at Quinto Fiorentino as do the cloaked women. It would therefore suggest to me that our workshop at Merlo is producing items that travel as far as Castellina in Chianti and then 90 kilometers north up to Quinto Fiorentino. The other thing that's interesting to me is that these items at Merlo are found in a residential context, while the pieces at Castellina in Chianti and at Quinto are in a funeral context. So it leads me to at least the conclusion that people who were buried in this type of tholos tomb, with the circular tomb with the large dromos, people who were buried in this type of tomb could well have been living in houses such as this, and vice versa. Remember that for this period in time, we have very little evidence for residential complexes for the Orientalizing period. So this is a very nice way to correlate a funeral context with a residential. The next building I want to look at is up here at the very southern end of the Piano del Tesoro, and it had no walls. It really consists of these column pads on which columns were placed to support a very heavy roof. You can see how substantial these pads are today. And here's a rendering of what this might have looked like. It's a little heavy, but may well have been something like this. Elaborately decorated. And because, like the other buildings, it was destroyed by fire and it was left relatively untouched, we have the roof almost as it collapsed and lying here in situ with all of the pieces. Allows us to reconstruct the roof with all of the elements. Here, unlike the gorgons of the upper building, we have female heads, again, probably deities, that were used to mask the end of the cover tiles. And I think that the reason that we're seeing females here and not gorgons is that these, I suspect, were facing interior into the courtyard and were not needed to be apotropaic, but they wanted to show the benign nature of the goddess. Two examples found in this building, together with this feline waterspout that allows us to reconstruct, again, the gutter system for this Orientalizing period building. It would have gone right along here. So remember, this is the lateral cyma, or the gutter, for the archaic building with the females and the lion spouts and the rosettes. And here is the one for the workshop of an earlier period. It's very clear when you see these that this one evolved out of this. And the first effort, probably with a low wall, was unsuccessful. The volume of water coming off that roof in a heavy rain would not have been stopped by this wall, and so it really doesn't serve the purpose. They extended the height of the wall here so that it forced the water to come through the lion spouts where it could be caught by jars underneath. What it shows to me, though, is the continuity in the architecture of this site from the Orientalizing period developing into the Archaic period. The building was a workshop, and it was very interestingly divided. Going to the west, we find that the work was dedicated to production of terracottas of a large scale, pan tiles, covered tiles, frieze plaques, and antefixes made from molds. The east side was dedicated to work in bronze. We have crucible fragments, we have fragments of ingots, we have bellows, and other items to indicate work in bronze. At the same time, together with the bronze, there was carving in antler, bone, and ivory. And that's not uncommon. If you think about bronze work, and if you're casting bronzes, usually you have to make small models first. Those models could be made out of terracotta, or they could be made out of wood, but it requires somebody who can carve in that manner of scale. And so we find large quantities of bone, antler, and ivory with bronze. And that occurs at other sites as well. In the center of the building, moving toward the west, right here, we had a very fortuitous find, a series of cover tiles that had been laid out to dry. So the tiles were prepared where they were in their green state. They were brought in probably to be under the protection of the roof in case it rained, or also you don't want the direct heat of the sun to dry them out too quickly. They'll crack. So they were lying carefully arranged out here and lying out to dry. But then, unfortunately, the fire took place and destroyed the building. And the workers, either to put out the fire or to get out of the building, ran over these tiles and left their human footprints embedded in the tiles. And the heat of the conflagration baked the tiles. So we have complete sets of human footprints dating to this period sometime between 620 and 580. And you can see right there. This is one of our conservators at the time who's preparing the footprints for plaster casts. And you can see, some people have said the Etruscans were tiny people. This is about a size 10.5 to 11 foot in American standards, all right? So he wasn't tiny, at least not this person. We do have some smaller feet, and in fact, one impression of, I think, a woman, small size 5, wearing a slipper with a pointed toe. So it's kind of interesting. A fragment of a mold lying on the floor of the workshop, and a face, which was also used as a mask, that was made from a mold of this type. I say a mold of this type, not necessarily this mold. If you were to look carefully, you would see there's a flaw in this mold. There's a little hole that developed in the mold. A pebble fell out. And if this had been made from this mold, there would have been a reciprocal hole, actually a bump forward on this side. So this was either made from a different mold or it was made from this mold before the mold deteriorated. The face is interesting. It's a canopic type, named after the canopic cinerary urns that we find near Cusi and in the vicinity. A male face, perhaps. And if so, and if it's a mask that sits on the building next to the female, if the female is the mistress of the beasts, perhaps we can see here the master of the beasts. That's one possible interpretation. The other is that it so resembles a death mask of the canopic type that perhaps it's intended to represent one of the ancestors, and again allows the owner of the building to demonstrate his lineage and his relationship to an ancestor, the ancestor's relationship to the deity, and hence it glorifies his line and legitimizes his authority. On the eastern side, these fragments, these are all crucible fragments. You can see two large bellows. This bellows, actually, is about the size of a bellows that was found in Phidias's workshop in Olympia, and we know the size of bronzes and statues he was creating. So it's an interesting size. We also have a fragment of an ingot and various other pieces that clearly demonstrate work in metal. Fragments of antler. You can see that they used every part of the antler to create their figures, from discs to figures in the round, to little inlays of petals, more discs. You can even see the cut marks here, the leg bones of an animal, the Gryphon, and small plaques. So we have this building in yellow and the workshop, a residence and a workshop. And now let me just take a moment to look at this area in here. Excavations were done in this area in 1968 and 1969. But at that time, there's a very high water table up there, which is good, which is probably one of the reasons they picked it, because they can have a well and they can have good sources of water. But the water was so high that in those early years, we really couldn't excavate there in June. We had to wait until probably the middle of July, and that's when we could excavate in here because the water had receded. That hasn't been the case in the last 20 years, but I remember as a student going there that we had to bail this area out and drain it out very frequently before we could get in. So the excavators in those days had difficulty with the water level, and also at the time they did not know the full form of the building in blue. So they were in some ways feeling their way in the dark about the excavation, and it got too complicated and they pulled out and stopped. We went back in 1997, was it, Tony? 96, 97. And lo and behold, we found another building. I don't know if you can see it, but there it is. It's lying under the foundations of the big building of the Archaic period. It's a remarkable building because of its design. It is tripartite, which is a very formal structure, unusual for this period. And its dimensions, 4.6 meters in its 2 flanking rooms, while the middle cella, or middle chamber, is almost exactly double, 9.4. It's a very formal structure. And it would lead us to believe that a building of this design and this formality could well have served a particular function, an important building in the site, on the community, perhaps a ceremonial function, or perhaps even a religious function. We know later, of course, that Etruscan temples are 3-celled, tripartite. I wonder what we're looking at here. Again, another illustration, just to give you an idea of the volume or size. I don't know where the doors are, we don't know where the windows are, but certainly gives you a sense. Adding to this sense of perhaps the ceremonial nature or the religious nature of the building were some fragments of pottery found close to the southwest corner. And here you see 3 of the pieces, this one, and this one. This actually, I think, was found a little further away, not in the building. But first thing that jumps out at you, of course, is that we have an inscription. And in fact, there are 2 distinct cups here. You'll see that the design is different. This is not the same as this. We have 2 different cups, 2 different hands at work, and the inscriptions are very interesting. They have been studied and published by Professor Wallace, who is here today, Rex. And these form a type of inscription that are called muluvanike, which basically means given as a gift. In this particular case, I think Professor Wallace has determined that this is an individual, Velthor Pythina, is that correct? And so the inscription says, Velthor Pythina gave me. And that's a standard formulaic construction for this type of cup. There are a series of these cups that are found at various sites that were given as gifts. Now, whether it's given, it doesn't give it gives the donor's name, but it doesn't give the recipient's name. So it could be given as a gift to a deity, or it could be given as a gift to the owner. And the Pythina name is an interesting name. It does occur at other sites, but it's also a variant of that name is associated with the site of Caere or Cervetri. So perhaps what we're seeing here is a gift from one elite family in Cervetri to an elite family here in Merlo for whatever reasons. It could be political reasons, alliances, what have you. A fragment of the belly of a vessel. In the interior, we have a raised decoration. And I show you here, I'm going to jump to Poggio Aguzzo, which is the hill right next to Poggio Civitate, where we have found a series of tombs belonging to the early period. And I just simply show these because we have 2 types of cups. This one here, 2 views of this cup, and this cup. And these are the types, the shapes, that we find from those fragments I showed you earlier. This type of cup is felt to have had its origins in the area around Populonia or Vetulonia, while this type seems to come from Cervetri. What is interesting is the chronology. These can go anywhere, depending on the 3 archaeologists who have done the most research on this, to sometime between 650 to as early as probably 700. Now, that's important for us. It means that even if we were to take a date of 675, these cups dating to this period are lying on the floor of that building. What does it tell us about the date of that building? There are all kinds of explanations that you give. You could say it's an heirloom. It came from somebody else who kept it for a number of years and then gave it to this person. Or you could say that it actually represents as an indicator of how long this building was standing, and the building may have gone back to at least 650. We'll come back to that in a minute. Here's another example of a parallel. This cup from Monteriggione, which is now in the Guarnacci Museum in Volterra. Again, you see the similarity in shape. This one also has a an inscription, a dedicatory inscription. The name is not Pythina, but it is another name of a donor. So, if we look at these early rooms, we have 3 rooms to look at. This one, which is clearly a residence, this one, which is clearly a workshop, and this one, which may be a building that was used for religious or ceremonial purposes. And they sort of have this little courtyard in the middle. What does that tell us about the later building? Well, perhaps we can see then, in this large structure of the Archaic period, a building that had a workshop near a water source, a ceremonial wing on the west, with what may be an altar out in front of that 3-room compartment I showed you, and then a residential section on the north that went 2 stories and at least 25 feet in height. All right, now, let me sort of wind this up and bring us to a new excavation. And again, I want to thank my colleague, Professor Tuck, for so generously sharing this, because it isn't published material. So you're extremely privileged to get to see this before he rushes to publication. But this is the area that his team worked on, one of his teams worked on this summer, and we have another building that was uncovered. If you can start to see it, it is a large building, 20 meters in length by 7 some odd meters in width, and it may look like this. Now, if you were in the Greek world and saw this, you would say, wow, this is a megaron. It's a megaron shape. And that's very, very interesting. What's also interesting is that if we were to go down the road where we saw the same stamp, remember from Roselli, we find that there's another building, and look at the outline here. Very, very similar to my eye to what we have at Merlo. This building is said by the excavators, Donati and others, to date to sometime around 650 to 600. The building has been reconstructed in an interesting manner. It's also a large building, 26 meters by 7. It's actually not purely a building, it's a recinto. And you can see it here with a small structure in the center that has been reconstructed as having a thatched roof, and then 2 enclosures. These are 2 possible virtual reconstructions. I'm not sure I agree with that, and it's one of the questions that now, having seen the new building at Merlo, I would like to go back and speak with the archaeologists here and look at their evidence for a lack of tile, construction of a thatched roof, and also this enclosure-like structure, given the similarity, at least in the outline, to Merlo. If we go further north, near Volterra, to Casale Marittimo, we have 2 buildings. One, building Beta in pink, also said to be a very, very large structure. Again, the archaeologists there said no tiled roof. It was a thatched roof. And it was built also sometime around 650, but by 600, a second building was constructed, probably the last decades of the 7th century. I think they're going to say somewhere around 610. This building was constructed. See again the similarity with the Merlo building, but here they now say that the building has tiles. Interesting. At San Giovanale, we have another interesting complex. A series of post holes has been reconstructed by the Swedish excavation team as a rectangular building with a thatched roof. In fact, the more I look at this and I follow the post holes, I don't see a rectangular building. What I see is an apsidal building. And that to me is important because in the Greek world, you go from oval huts to apsidal buildings to rectangular buildings. We don't have very many examples of apsidal buildings at the moment. I wonder if maybe we look more carefully, we'll find some. It's a possibility. The second phase of this building, post 625, according to Lars Carlson, and in fact I've been in communication with Lars. Unfortunately, he wrote me back yesterday and said, I'll get you your answers tomorrow morning. So it isn't going to help us tonight. But again, look at the outline of the building. And here now, post 625, the building is reconstructed with tiles. The initial building was thatch. When I see this, and I talk to my colleague who excavated the Merlot building, and who feels that there may be a case to be made for a date of the Merlot building as early as 675? Okay, we've got some interesting questions here. How is it that we have at Merlot a building with tiles and with decoration at 675 when other buildings here that are similar are said to be 650 to 630 and certainly below 650, but the tiled versions to be closer to 630, 620? Well, if you follow Etruscan literature, a very dear friend of mine, Dr. Nancy Winter, has written a monumental book on the development of the Etruscan tiles and roof architecture. This book's about 600 pages, and it took 20 years of research. Nancy's view is that the idea, of the concept of the Greek tile, the terracotta tile was invented in Greece, in the area of Corinth and Isthmia nearby. And that took place sometime around 680, 670. And that idea was then transported from Greece to Italy, where it finds its first manifestations around Rome, around 650, and then works its way up north, so that by the time we get to Merlot, it's 630, 640, 630, and we have tiled roofs. Everybody that I know of respects Nancy and follows that. Hence, when I see all of these that conveniently are placed as roof tiled buildings that don't occur before 630, I'm puzzled. Because it looks like at Merlot we have a tiled roof building that goes way before that and almost contemporary with the so-called invention of tiles at Corinth and Isthmia. Which makes me wonder whether it isn't time for us to go back and look at chronology. How did we determine the dates of these other sites? How do we determine the dates at Corinth and Isthmia? And I know it's very, very controversial, but again, at some point, either the Merlot building has to shift to accommodate these others, or these others may have to shift in chronology to accommodate the new evidence at Merlot. I think it's an extremely exciting question. The other question I have when I see the Merlot building is, and I don't have any answer for this yet, but what are the social factors, the drivers, that suddenly bring about this change from oval huts to rectangular buildings? Prior to this, in the period around 700 to at least 675, and prior to 700, we have settlements and villages of small apsidal or oval huts, apsidal in Greece, oval in Italy, that are randomly placed with relatively no hierarchy in size. Then all of a sudden, these things start appearing in the community, a singular building that is larger than the others, that is very, very carefully laid out, and may well, if Merlot is an indicator, may well have been roofed in terracotta tiles. What drives that, and how is it being used? Many people would say that buildings of this type now serve a religious or ceremonial function. They were the home of the high priest, or a place where the high priest could meet, the members of the community could meet and have ritual ceremonies or whatever. So a number of questions come to my mind now about how to address this. The same phenomenon seems to occur in Greece. We go from oval huts to apsidal buildings at Perikora to Thermon, and then we get structures like this. So is there a relationship? Is there a cause and effect? Are these people, how closely are they interacting that at what may be exactly the same time, they are making this change? So, again, to conclude now, what we have is this new building, and you can see the buildings of the Orientalizing period. These three certainly all existed on the plateau at one time. They were all destroyed by the same fire. Now the question is, where does this fit in the sequence? As I look at it, it may well be that this precedes this building. And so we go from a megaron type to a tripartite type to, in the archaic period, this 3-room structure with perhaps an altar in front. So you see a nice internal development, just as you saw with the gutter system on the site. All right, the last question then, the one I started with, was what are these people doing up here and in Merlot, in the middle of nowhere? Well, as you can see from the interaction and the exchange of gifts, it was a highly, highly energetic period with a lot of interaction going on. We have Monteregione with similar type cups. We have Castellina in Chianti, where we have bone and antler objects that are the same. We have up here at Quinto Fiorentino objects from the same workshop, which would have been, I would contend, Merlot. Down here at Roselli, we have ceramics that are identical. In Vetalonia, we have cups that are very, very similar. Massa Marittima, we have handles of cups or lids for cups that are identical to what we have at Merlot. Papalonia, same types of cups that we've seen in the Muluvaniche type. And here at Casale Marittimo, we have, again, building Gamma, which looks very much like the recent discovery at Merlot. At Chiusi, you saw some Bucaro with the Potnia Theron. So all of this area, I think, as more excavations go, as we look more at our material at Merlot and look out to see where the connections are, we'll find that they're crisscrossed all throughout this area with strong interconnections and interactivity in this early period of the Orientalizing. Down here at Cervetri or Caire, we clearly have the Pathina cups that come up. We also know from Vulci that there are connections, Tarquinia. It may well be that Cervetri came up, that people from Cervetri came up the coast by ship to Elba, Giglio, making their way inland to Vetalonia, Papalonia, and probably turning in right here at Grosseto and coming up the Ombrone. You can also see how the Greek travelers came in and landed at all of these sites, Marsiliana, Tarquinia, Vulci, with their wares for trade. And although I don't have it up here, we certainly have from the Baltic all the amber that is coming down. This is a very, very active period in time, this late Orientalizing period, with this travel throughout the entire Mediterranean. And Merlot was not an isolated site. It was part of all of this intense activity. Thank you.